Oftentimes I pray for Mr. Moore, pray for his family as well. I recognize that I did something hideous. I was lost, sinking in a sea of sin. For me, life was over with. I just wanted to end life. And the question always came to mind, why am I here? Why am I here? Why do I even exist? Why do I even exist? My name is Toby Lynn Williams. I was charged with capital murder and I was sentenced to death.
This is a true story. I started off like that.
I just wanted to rebel. I wanted to cause chaos. So let's throw it out. We're gonna see who kills who.
I made the choice.
I knew I was going to get out of that car and murder those two men.
As he kneeled,
I killed them both. I stabbed them to death.
when we're young, we're not real bright. And we do some things that aren't real bright. Should we be judged for the rest of our lives? Or should we be given the opportunity that show that, hey, we learned from that, we grew from that? 36 years. That's just an unconscionable amount of time. When it comes to punishment, what's enough?
I spent most of my time in Shreveport, Louisiana. And I feel like things would have been different had I been raised with a loving mother and father. When I was 7 years old, I discovered that the lady that I was calling mom was my grandmother. When I was about 6 weeks old, my mother, she desired to give me to a family who were going to adopt me. So my grandmother's response was that if you don't want him, I'll take him, I'll keep him, and I'll raise him. My dad was non-existent. He went to prison for a murder case, and we never really got close. When my father came out of jail, he come to Louisiana, and I was delighted. I was extremely delighted to see him. When I went to live with him, eventually I started getting into fights with my stepbrothers, and they would jump on me all the time. it was always some violence between us. When I was 9 years old was the first time that I ever ran away from home and lived in the street, slept in the street. My criminality was basically about surviving. I had to steal and rob, or going into some store and lifting things out of the store because I was hungry. I started drinking and doing drugs, at least smoking marijuana, when I was about 10, 11. That's when and at 15 is when I had the armed robbery attempted murder case. I went and robbed a place because I was trying to come up on some money to purchase me more alcohol and more marijuana. And I received a juvenile life sentence, and I went into Louisiana Training Institute for Boys. When I came out of the boys' home, I feel like life had passed me by. So in order for me to catch up in life, I was going to have to find me some type of robbery, some type of heist, some type of crime that I commit where I could gain financially at the expense of somebody else's detriment. And that was my attitude at the particular time. Johnny Moore was a man that I had the opportunity to work for. He and his dad were responsible for opening the recreational vehicle business, and they needed some help, and they allowed me to work for them for about a week. One night, I heard two young men talking about how they had gotten fired by Mr. Moore's dad, and I seen that as an opportunity to commit the robbery of Mr. Moore. I believe that law enforcement would hold them responsible because they had a motive to commit the crime based on being fired by Mr. Moore. But the problem was that Mr. Moore knew me, and the solution to that was that Mr. Moore would have to be eliminated. I feel like I had to murder him to prevent him from identifying me in the courtroom. I knew that Mr. Moore had a baby, so I desired to have someone there to basically watch, to make sure nothing happens to that child. As I was going to the house, I seen Wilma and Victoria walking in my direction. Wilma and Victoria were two young ladies living in the neighborhood. I said we should be able to acquire at least $500,000 out of this robbery, and they basically agreed to it. And so we go over to Mr. Moore's house. I knocked on the door. He comes out, and I pulled the 357 on him, and I asked him if he would go back in the house, and he went back in. When we went into his room, his wife and his son were laying there on the bed. Eventually, we started moving property from his house onto his truck. The girls just watched the Moors and the baby. And then I just basically held them at gunpoint and told them that we were going somewhere, basically. We all piled in a car and came over here into Texas to throw law enforcement off, to convince them that someone in Texas had committed the crime instead of someone out of Louisiana. When we got into Texas, that's when I had Mr. Moore and Mrs. Moore to get out of the car. I didn't care anything about my own life, and I was trying to get the courage out of not caring anything about my own life to be able to do something like this that I had never done before. And once I had built up the courage, I just dropped the gun and shot. Miss Moore's back was to me, and it went through her and struck him. Immediately after I had shot them, I wanted to shoot Mr. Moore to make sure that he was dead, but Victoria, she approached me and she expressed that he would die. Let's just leave him. So we piled in the car with the baby, and I just left the body there.
November and December is always cold in this area. I've been here about 40-some years. This is family land, so I wind up building a little house here. Back in the early 80s, I was in the bed sleeping, and I don't know exactly what time of morning it was, but it was way after midnight, I do know that. We heard a knock at the door and somebody pleading for help. I was thinking they're gonna come and rob me. That was my first thought. It was kind of scary feeling because nothing like that ever happened in this area. We peeped out the window first, and he was standing right at the door here at the front door. He said, "My wife been shot. They shot me, they shot my wife." He was holding both hands like right here. That's one thing I won't never forget. You could see the hole. You didn't see any blood, but I'm assuming he's bleeding on the inside. He said, "I know who did it, I know who did it. They took my car and they got my baby." I said, "Where's your wife?" He said, "She's up the road." We're about a quarter of a mile from my house. This is where all it happened, right here on the side of the road. The man jumped in the back of the truck and he rode on up here. And that's when we saw the lady laying on the ground. This is where she was laying, kind of in onto the side here. Her feet's over here, her head kind of laying this way, and she was just laying there, not moving. I didn't see any blood that much. The man got out the truck, and he was looking at his wife. I don't know, he just assumed she was going to be okay also, I guess. And by that time, the police had came. they loaded him into the ambulance and, you know, taking him off. I found out later that she was dead.
Here's a picture of Debbie. I don't think she's happy with me taking that picture, but she got over it. Here's a picture of her and Cuddles. Cuddles was a teacup chihuahua, little bitty thing. Cuddles and Debbie sleeping. That seems to be a recurring theme. My name is Johnny Moore. Debbie was my first love. She was my wife, my friend, my confidant. We were 19 days short of being married 3 years the night she died. I met Deborah at church. A friend of mine introduced me and Debbie to each other, and we went out, I guess, a week or two later, and just the romance grew from there. We dated about a year, 16 months, something like that, before we got married. We enjoyed doing things together and just got along good, you know. Our son was born in 1984. He's bringing back the good memories. Instead of the bad memories, he's bringing back the good memories, you know. We were, of course, still a young couple, and it's no bed of roses, but we were making it. She adored our son, and he would never get to the floor without having a new set of clothes on. He was her pride and joy. You know, that was her life, was taking care of him. She was a good mother. She was a good friend. She was a good person. It don't sound like much, does it? But it is. Debbie died on December 20th of 1984. It took 12 years of my life to get where I could handle it. I am over it now? Not 100%. No, I never will be. Yes, it still brings up bad stuff, but I can talk about it now. Yeah.
You know, there is a scripture that says, what is your life? It is a vapor. It appeareth for a while and then it vanishes. My name is John S. Walker, and I've been a practicing attorney for about 50 years. In 1984, I was prosecutor in Panola County. I prosecuted all types of cases, murders, rapes, robberies, you name it, I did it all. One of the cases was State versus Toby Williams. It was pretty well known generally about the horrific nature of the facts of the case. Toby Williams basically hijacked or kidnapped the victims and took them out in the country down this lonely road and proceeded to have them undress in the middle of the road in the wintertime. They were crying and hugging themselves in the frigid air in the middle of a road. And then he decided he wanted to see two white people have sex. I don't use such language, but he basically said, I want to see white folks fuck. I expected the verdict to be what it was. I really did. And I think he expected it too. I remember Mr. Williams making a under-breath comment. Well, I just want him to get it over with fast. I think Mr. Williams' outrageous conduct is something that society cannot tolerate.
Got a knock on the door, and got met with a .357 pistol in the face. You know, he drug out for hours. Toby said we're gonna go for a drive. Debbie was holding George, and I was holding her. We didn't have a chance to talk. We just exchanged looks, I guess is the best way to say it, and that she was scared and holding our son, you know, holding George close. I knew in my heart that was not a good deal, you know, and Debbie knew that also. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But this was not going to end good. One of the girls demanded that we give George to them. Toby was calm and collective. He knew what he was doing. We did get undressed, but that's all that, you know, that was it. I was down to my briefs. She was down to her bra and panties. I never heard the gunshot. To this day, I've never heard the gunshot. Next thing I know, I'm on the ground. I hear Debbie's breath going out of her. And I looked over and I knew she was gone. After I got to the hospital, the doctor examined me and they decided I needed emergency surgery. I was worried about my son. I didn't know where he was at. I can't remember if I was in the ER or leaving the ER headed to the operating room. And somebody told me they had got a phone call for a lady finding a baby on the front porch of the house. They had already found my son, and I got to see him before. Excuse me. I got to see him before I went to surgery. Yes, I feel guilty that I lived and she didn't. But I also felt, you know, that I was glad that she died quickly. She didn't have to suffer. I was glad for that she didn't have to suffer. There's no way Toby Williams could ever pay for what happened that night. You cannot replace somebody's life.
How do you feel towards Toby Williams today?
I don't care to talk about Toby Williams.
Is that just about not letting it impact you ever again?
I don't care to talk about Toby Williams.
You can't just automatically judge people on their past. These people who were killers are not the men that they were at that moment. There is a possibility of redemption. My name is Thomas Watley, and I've known Toby Williams for 10 years. I lead the prison ministry at the George Vito unit in Tennessee County, Texas. When he went into prison, he was a thug. He'd fight. He, did all the drugs. He stole, he lied, he killed. He was just a bad actor. When I met Toby, he was trying to define himself, understand who he was in prison. Initially in class, he just kind of soaked in what we were talking about. And then he started just sharing about the traumas that he experienced in his early life.
My mother, I didn't know her. I basically traveled life's journey feeling pretty much that way, that, man, if your own mom don't love you, nobody in life will ever love you.
Toby is suffering inside. You hear it in his voice. We all want to know our mother. We want to know our father. We want to know who we are. You know, I've always been loved, but I would think without love, life has to be hard. You don't have any sense of worth, sense of self. Being loved means your value as an individual develops.
Yeah, when I was 10 years old, I had befriended a young guy in the community, and we would go around, we would ride bikes, and on occasion we would steal bikes. And there was someone in his family that, I don't know if it was his brother or his uncle, that I had encountered, and I desired to look to him as a father figure or a big brother. And so we go out to this Dallas drainage ditch and do the crawdad fishing. The next thing I know, he was looking down on me in his lust. And at that particular time, he raped me. And I wanted to scream for help. I wanted someone to come to my rescue. But I decided that I didn't want anyone later on to come to my rescue, because as I thought about it, someone would perhaps come to my rescue and ridicule me. So I just laid there hoping that the matter would soon be over with. So later on, he stood up and he pulled his pants up and he said, "And don't you tell nobody." And I took that as my cue that I could get up. So I got up and I pulled my pants up and I made my way out of that drainage ditch. I never told anyone. I made my way from that particular moment to the back of the house where my grandmother and me lived, and I discarded those semen-stained underwear, and I locked that little boy up in the dungeon of my soul.
I never told anyone. How can you be hurt and not tell somebody about it? Help. He's been crying for help all his life. It's hard to make that intellectual leap that that's what caused him to commit murder. But we know there are a series of events in his life that got harder and harder and harder and tougher and tougher and tougher that led him to that path. Toby is worthy of sympathy. He did a horrific crime. We cannot forget that. And when we do what's wrong, yes, we are punished. But at the same time, we have to be forgiving and pray that Toby over time will learn from this and change his ways. That's what we're talking about.
I fish as often as I can. I fish here in the backyard. I fish on my boat. I'll go down to the local fishing piers. Being incarcerated, you're in a cage. and you don't get to do these simple little pleasures of life. And 20 years not being able to do it is, that's a lot of missing. Toby Williams was my first actual cellie that I had when I was incarcerated. The first about 8 months, we were locked in our cell 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you don't really have a lot to do except get to know those that you're in there with, which is one person. And Toby and I have just been friends ever since. People would assume that Toby is a rabid monster, that if he were ever to be around, anybody would be trying to plot and scheme how to harm them, take advantage of them, take their property, any one of a number of bad things. And Toby is none of those things. I don't know that a day, week, month, or year ever goes by where it doesn't weigh on him the damage that he did. On death row, in that cell by yourself, day in and day out, you come to the realization something went wrong. The path that Toby chose was to try to correct himself, and he has. He started educating himself. He started listening to other people's opinions about stuff. He has an exemplary record. He participates in everything. If you need something, he's there. He's not trying to take, he's trying to give because of what he took. Toby's an old man now. And I think that the amount of time that he's spent in there has paid for what he's done. I really do. He hasn't done anything that would prevent him from getting parole, so why doesn't he get parole? If you keep him in prison the whole time, that's a death sentence. It's a living death sentence, but it's a death sentence nonetheless. So, again, what is enough?
My outlook on life changed a lot. I'm happy what I do. Been married again for almost 13 years. Here we go. Went down and jumped in the Mediterranean.
Well, that was fun.
Y'all said it was cold.
It was, but we got in anyhow.
My wife is Belinda. She's been through a lot that I've been through. We try to enjoy things, do things, travel when we can, because tomorrow is not promised, you know. So you never stop missing. It gets better with time. Belinda understands it. Debbie's part of my life, and it goes from there. I do think that a person who gets the death penalty deserves to have an appeal. I think that's fair. But if they do the crime, you know, they need to pay the price. Because the people who die, like Debbie, they don't get to have an appeal. They don't get to have a second chance, or, you know, that's all taken away from them in just a blink of an eye. I was very blessed that I had my sister and my mother to help me with George. But he missed having a mother. She missed watching him walk, go to school, graduate, get married. I still think about it today that she doesn't get to see how his life has turned out. He missed all that. She missed all that. We missed all that.
I often prayed for death. But I often prayed to God that he would just take my life. That's changed now. Glory to God, all of that's changed now. I have accepted Christ, and I see things from a different perspective because now I have an appreciation for life.
Debbie was my wife, my friend, my confidant. There's no way Toby Williams could ever pay for what happened that night. You cannot replace somebody's life.
First of all, I would ask Mr. Johnny and all his family to forgive me for having interfered with their lives because I had no right to do such. I realized and recognized that I did something hideous. And if I could take that back, I would. Oftentimes I pray for Mr. Moore, pray for his family as well. I've considered that it must have been tough for him to rebuild his life. How am I trying to make amends? I've written a book entitled A Date with Death, Redemption. It tells of my transformation. I would like to take proceeds from that book to start a nonprofit organization in the name of Deborah Gale Moore for the purpose of reaching out to people who have endured such as the crime that I committed against her.
Toby Williams seemed to have them undressed in the middle of the road in the wintertime. And he basically said, I want to see white folks fuck.
Is that true?
No, sir.
But you wanted them naked.
Yes, sir.
Why did you not mention that to us?
It slipped my mind, but I don't mind talking about it at all. The purpose was to get them aligned, That was the purpose, to get them aligned for one shot. I wanted to be able to get away as fast as possible without drawing any attention to what was going on. It would be heartbreaking to have to continue in this prison. I look forward to one day walking out of here.
How would you think Johnny Moore might feel if you were released?
Wow, that's something I never thought about. That's something I never thought about. I don't know. I don't even know how to answer that. I can say I believe that he would feel angry by it if I am released from this prison.
On the afternoon of October 3rd, SIL 1984, an ordinary autumn day in the small community of Queensville, Ontario, changed the lives of countless people in ways no one could have imagined. It was a quiet rural area north of Toronto where neighbors knew one another, children walked familiar roads, and parents believed the community offered a sense of security that larger cities often could not. That confidence was shattered when 9-year-old Christine Jessup disappeared after leaving home on what should have been a routine errand. More than 3 decades would pass before forensic science finally identified the man responsible, making the case one of Canada's most significant examples of how preserved evidence and advances in DNA technology can reshape the course of a cold case investigation. Christine lived with her family in Queensville, a close-knit village in what was then York Region. According to the historical record, she left her home during the afternoon to walk to a nearby convenience store. The distance was short, and the trip was familiar. Nothing about the day suggested danger. For families in the community, children running small errands alone was not unusual. It was part of everyday life in a rural town where trust was woven into the routines of daily living. When Christine failed to return home, concern quickly replaced routine. At first, her family hoped there had been a simple delay or misunderstanding. As more time passed, those hopes began to fade. Family members searched nearby roads and fields while neighbors joined the effort. Calls were made to police, and what had begun as a missing child report rapidly became an extensive search involving local residents, investigators, and volunteers. As evening approached, the urgency intensified. Police organized search operations covering roadsides, wooded areas, fields, and nearby properties. Officers interviewed people who might have seen Christine during the afternoon. Investigators worked to establish a reliable timeline, asking where she had last been seen and whether anyone had noticed unusual vehicles or unfamiliar individuals in the area. Those first hours were critical, and detectives documented every lead available to them. The disappearance deeply affected Queensville almost immediately. Communities like this often define themselves through familiarity and trust, and the unexplained disappearance of a child challenged those assumptions. Parents began keeping children closer to home. Residents watched the search unfold with growing anxiety, hoping that Christine would be found alive. Volunteers continued combing the surrounding countryside, determined to assist investigators in any way possible. Police issued public appeals for information, encouraging anyone who had been in the area on October 3rd to come forward. Detectives gathered witness statements, compared timelines, and attempted to reconstruct Christine's movements during the afternoon. As with many missing child investigations, officers faced the difficult task of evaluating numerous reports while determining which information could be independently verified. Every potential sighting required careful examination. Days passed without confirmation of Christine's whereabouts. The absence of reliable evidence complicated the investigation, and uncertainty spread throughout the community. Families followed media reports closely, hoping each update would bring positive news. Instead, the case remained unresolved, and concern gradually turned into fear. Throughout the investigation, detectives emphasized the importance of preserving every piece of physical evidence and carefully documenting every interview. At the time, forensic DNA technology had not yet developed into the powerful investigative tool it would later become. Nevertheless, investigators collected and preserved evidence according to the best standards available in 1984. That decision made during the earliest days of the investigation would eventually prove crucial many years later, although no one could have predicted just how significant it would become. The disappearance also attracted increasing media attention across Ontario. News organizations reported on the expanding search and the community's efforts to locate Christine. The story resonated with parents throughout Canada because it reflected a fear shared by families everywhere, that an ordinary afternoon could suddenly become a tragedy without warning. As investigators continued following leads, they also confronted the reality that missing person investigations often become more difficult as time passes. Witness memories begin to fade. Physical traces disappear. Opportunities to reconstruct precise movements diminish. Detectives therefore worked methodically, recording information that might later become significant even if its immediate value was unclear. Looking back with the benefit of history, the events of October 3rd, SIL 1984, marked the beginning of an investigation that would profoundly influence Canadian policing, forensic science, and the criminal justice system. The disappearance itself was only the first chapter in a case that would eventually involve one of Canada's most notable wrongful convictions, major reforms in forensic practice, and, decades later, the successful use of forensic genetic genealogy to identify the perpetrator. Yet on that October evening, none of those future developments were known. Investigators, volunteers, and Christine's family shared one immediate goal: finding a missing 9-year-old girl and bringing her home safely. The uncertainty surrounding her disappearance weighed heavily on everyone involved, and as darkness settled over Queensville, the search continued, driven by hope, determination, and the belief that answers might still be found. Those first hours would become the foundation of an investigation that, although it would span more than 30 years, never completely lost sight of the questions first asked on that autumn afternoon. What happened to Christine Jessup, and who was responsible? The search for Christine Jessup intensified as October 3rd gave way to the following days. What had begun as a local effort involving family members, neighbors, and York Regional Police quickly expanded into one of the largest missing child investigations Ontario had seen at that time. Officers systematically searched fields, wooded areas, drainage ditches, farms, and roads surrounding Queensville, believing that every hour increased the importance of locating the 9-year-old. Investigators focused first on establishing a verified timeline. They interviewed family members to understand Christine's movements before she left home that afternoon. Detectives also sought information from residents who might have been traveling through the area or working outdoors on October 3rd. As with many missing person investigations, police carefully distinguished confirmed sightings from reports that could not be independently verified. Media coverage expanded rapidly. Television broadcasts, newspaper articles, and radio reports circulated Christine's photograph throughout Ontario. Authorities appealed directly to the public, asking anyone who had seen her or noticed unusual activity in the Queensville area to contact investigators. Hundreds of tips were received, requiring detectives to evaluate each lead while attempting to determine whether any could be connected to the disappearance. The investigation unfolded during a period when many forensic techniques available today did not yet exist. DNA profiling was not part of routine criminal investigations in Canada in 1984. As a result, detectives relied heavily on witness interviews, physical searches, forensic examination of available evidence, and traditional investigative methods. Every interview was documented, every reported sighting reviewed, and every piece of physical evidence preserved according to the standards of the day. Despite the extensive search effort, no confirmed trace of Christine was located during the weeks following her disappearance. The absence of immediate evidence complicated the investigation. Detectives continued expanding the search area while coordinating with other police agencies and following information received from across the province. Many tips ultimately proved unrelated, but investigators continued reviewing them carefully, recognizing that even seemingly minor details could become important. The disappearance deeply affected the Queensville community. Parents became increasingly cautious, schools reinforced safety discussions, and residents remained alert for unfamiliar vehicles or suspicious activity. Although concerns spread throughout the region, investigators repeatedly encouraged the public to rely on verified information rather than speculation. Maintaining the integrity of the investigation required distinguishing documented facts from rumor. As autumn turned toward winter, the search continued. Volunteers, police officers, and emergency personnel devoted significant time and resources to locating Christine. The investigation remained active, but the questions confronting detectives became increasingly difficult. Without confirmed evidence indicating where she had gone after leaving home, investigators faced the challenge of reconstructing events with limited information. Nearly 3 months after Christine disappeared, on December 31st, SIL 1984, her body was discovered in a wooded area near Sunderland, Ontario, approximately 50 kilometers northeast of Queensville. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing child case into a homicide investigation. Forensic investigators immediately secured the scene, documenting and collecting physical evidence under controlled conditions. Those preservation efforts would later prove critically important. The post-mortem examination confirmed that Christine had been the victim of homicide. Investigators began examining the physical evidence recovered from the scene while continuing to reconstruct the events surrounding her disappearance. Detectives also expanded efforts to identify individuals who may have been in the relevant areas during the time between October 3rd and the discovery of her remains. Although investigators now knew the disappearance had ended in tragedy, many essential questions remained unanswered. Who had abducted Christine? How had she been transported? Why had she been targeted? The available evidence did not immediately provide those answers. The homicide investigation would continue for years, ultimately becoming one of the most significant criminal investigations in Canadian history, and later playing a major role in the development of forensic DNA practices and the use of preserved evidence in cold case investigations. Following the discovery of Christine Jessup's body on December 31st, SIL 1984, investigators entered a new phase of the case. The investigation shifted from locating a missing child to identifying the person responsible for her death. York Regional Police, working with forensic specialists, carefully documented the recovery site and examined all available physical evidence. Every item collected was preserved according to the forensic standards of the time, a decision that would later prove crucial as DNA technology advanced. Detectives continued interviewing witnesses and reviewing information gathered during the previous months. They reconstructed Christine's known movements on October 3rd, SIL 1984, examined reports of suspicious vehicles and individuals, and compared witness accounts for consistency. Hundreds of tips had already been received from members of the public, and investigators systematically assessed each one. The investigation attracted significant media attention across Canada. Newspapers and television news reported regularly on developments, encouraging additional witnesses to come forward. While increased publicity generated new information, it also required investigators to distinguish verified evidence from rumor and speculation. Police consistently emphasized that conclusions would be based on corroborated facts rather than public assumptions. As investigators worked through the evidence, attention eventually focused on individuals who had lived or worked in the broader area. One of those individuals was Guy Paul Morin, whose name became associated with the investigation during the mid-1980s. After an extensive investigation, Morin was charged with Christine Jessup's murder. The prosecution of Guy Paul Morin became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Canadian history. In 1986, he was tried, but the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a mistrial. Prosecutors later pursued the case again, and in 1992, Morin was convicted of first-degree murder. The conviction was controversial from the outset. Throughout the proceedings, Morin consistently maintained his innocence. His defense challenged aspects of the evidence presented by the Crown, and questions were raised regarding investigative methods and the reliability of certain forensic techniques available at the time. During the early 1990s, forensic DNA analysis was developing rapidly. Biological evidence preserved from Christine Jessup's investigation was re-examined using these newer scientific methods. The testing ultimately demonstrated that the DNA recovered from the crime scene did not match Guy Paul Morin. Those findings fundamentally changed the direction of the case. In 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned Morin's conviction, and he was acquitted. The DNA evidence established that he was not the source of the biological material recovered during the investigation. The wrongful conviction prompted one of Canada's most significant public inquiries into the criminal justice system. The Commission on Proceedings involving Guy Paul Morin, led by the Honorable Fred Kaufman, examined the investigation, prosecution, forensic practices, and systemic factors that contributed to the wrongful conviction. The inquiry produced extensive recommendations that influenced policing, forensic science, evidence disclosure, and prosecutorial practices across Canada. Although Morin had been exonerated, Christine Jessup's murder remained unsolved. Detectives retained the preserved forensic evidence, recognizing that future scientific advances might provide new investigative opportunities. Rather than closing the file permanently, investigators continued treating the homicide as an active cold case whenever new technologies or investigative methods became available. The preservation of biological evidence proved especially important. As DNA analysis continued to evolve over the following decades, forensic scientists developed increasingly sensitive techniques capable of extracting more information from evidence collected years earlier. Those advances laid the foundation for the next major chapter in the investigation, one that would not unfold until decades after Christine disappeared on that October afternoon in 1984. By the mid-1990s, the Christine Jessup investigation had entered an unusual and deeply consequential phase. The criminal case that had once appeared resolved had instead become a landmark example of the importance of scientific evidence in correcting miscarriages of justice. DNA testing had excluded Guy Paul Morin as the source of the biological evidence recovered during the investigation, leading to the overturning of his conviction and his acquittal in 1995. Although one of the most significant questions had been answered, that Morin was not responsible, the central question remained unresolved. Who had killed 9-year-old Christine Jessup? The Ontario government established the Commission on Proceedings involving Guy Paul Morin, led by the Honorable Fred Kaufman, to examine how an innocent man had come to be convicted. The inquiry reviewed thousands of pages of investigative records, court transcripts, forensic reports, and witness testimony. Rather than focusing solely on one decision or one individual, the Commission examined the criminal justice process as a whole. The Commission's report, released in 1998, identified numerous systemic issues. It emphasized the importance of objective investigations, proper disclosure of evidence, careful forensic practice, and the need to avoid tunnel vision and investigative bias in which attention becomes focused on one suspect while alternative explanations receive insufficient consideration. These recommendations influence police services, prosecutors, forensic laboratories, and courts across Canada. For the Jessup investigation itself, however, the report did not identify the person responsible for Christine's murder. Detectives returned to the evidence with renewed determination. The preserved biological material remained one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. Unlike witness memories, which naturally fade over time, properly preserved DNA evidence retains its scientific value when stored correctly. The case therefore became an active cold case investigation. Investigators periodically reviewed witness statements, re-examined physical evidence, and compared the unknown DNA profile against Canada's National DNA Databank as additional offender profiles were added over the years. Each comparison represented another opportunity to identify the unknown individual whose biological evidence had been recovered during the investigation. Despite repeated database searches, no match was identified. This result suggested that the unknown individual had either never submitted a DNA sample to the national database or was otherwise absent from the available reference profiles. Detectives therefore faced a familiar challenge in modern cold case investigations. They possessed a reliable DNA profile, but no direct means of identifying the person to whom it belonged. Throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, advances in forensic science continued. DNA analysis became more sensitive, laboratory procedures improved, and scientists developed increasingly sophisticated methods for interpreting complex biological samples. At the same time, investigators around the world began recognizing the value of preserving evidence indefinitely in unsolved homicide cases. Cases once considered unlikely to be solved increasingly benefited from technologies that had not existed when the crimes occurred. The Christine Jessup investigation remained among those carefully preserved cases. Although no immediate breakthrough occurred, detectives continued maintaining the evidence, reviewing investigative files, and monitoring developments in forensic science. The investigation demonstrated an important principle of cold case work. The absence of immediate answers does not necessarily indicate that answers will never be found. By the 2010s, another major development began changing homicide investigations internationally: forensic genetic genealogy. Rather than relying solely on direct comparisons with criminal DNA databases, this emerging investigative technique used publicly available genealogical information, where legally authorized, to identify biological relatives of an unknown DNA source. Investigators could then construct family trees and gradually narrow the list of potential individuals through traditional investigative methods. Canadian investigators followed these developments closely. Although forensic genetic genealogy required careful legal, ethical, and scientific consideration, successful applications in several high-profile cold cases demonstrated its potential. The Christine Jessup investigation possessed exactly the kind of preserved biological evidence that could potentially benefit from such advances. Years of meticulous evidence preservation now became critically important. The biological evidence collected in 1984 had survived decades because investigators, forensic scientists, and evidence custodians had maintained rigorous standards. Decisions made at the original crime seen long before anyone imagined forensic genetic genealogy created the possibility that future technologies might reveal information impossible to obtain in the 1980s or 1990s. The investigation therefore entered a new scientific era. Rather than beginning again from the start, detectives built upon decades of careful police work, original witness interviews, crime scene documentation, laboratory records, and preserved forensic evidence remained available for review. The case illustrated how modern cold case investigations often depend not on a single dramatic discovery, but on the cumulative value of disciplined investigative practices maintained over many years. As investigators prepared to apply new forensic techniques, they remained guided by the same principle that had defined the case since 1984. Every conclusion had to be supported by verifiable evidence. Scientific advances could provide new investigative leads, but those leads required independent confirmation through established investigative procedures. The search for Christine Jessup's killer therefore continued, now supported by technologies that investigators in 1984 could scarcely have imagined, but still grounded in the careful preservation of evidence collected on the very first days of the investigation. For more than 2 decades after Guy Paul Morin was exonerated in 1995, the murder of Christine Jessup remained officially unsolved. Investigators possessed a DNA profile from biological evidence associated with the crime, but repeated comparisons against Canada's National DNA Databank did not identify the individual who had left it. The absence of a match suggested that the person responsible had never had a qualifying DNA profile entered into the national database, or that no legal basis existed to obtain one directly. During the late 2000s and 2010s, forensic science underwent another significant transformation with the development of forensic genetic genealogy, FGG. Unlike traditional forensic DNA comparisons, which look for an exact match between an unknown profile and profiles already held in law enforcement databases, FGG seeks genetic relatives through genealogy databases where users have chosen to make their DNA available for matching under applicable policies. Investigators can then construct family trees and, through conventional police work, identify individuals who fit the circumstances of a case. This investigative approach first gained widespread public attention after its successful use in several major cold cases in the United States. Law enforcement agencies in Canada and elsewhere monitored these developments closely, recognizing that the method could provide investigative leads in cases where conventional DNA database searches had reached a dead end. However, authorities also recognized that the technique required careful legal review, scientific validation, and respect for privacy laws before it could be used. The Christine Jessup investigation was among the Canadian cold cases considered suitable for renewed forensic review because biological evidence collected in 1984 had been preserved according to accepted forensic standards. That preservation proved essential. Without high-quality DNA evidence, forensic genetic genealogy would not have been possible. York Regional Police worked with forensic specialists to determine whether the preserved DNA profile could be analyzed using newer methods. The resulting genealogical research did not itself identify a suspect. Instead, it generated investigative leads by identifying biological relatives of the unknown DNA source. Genealogists then used historical records, publicly available information, and documented family relationships to construct family trees extending across multiple generations. Once those family trees were developed, detectives returned to traditional investigative methods. They reviewed historical records, examined geographic connections, evaluated timelines, and determined which individuals within the identified family networks could realistically be connected to the case. This illustrates an important aspect of forensic genetic genealogy. Genealogy narrows the field of inquiry, but investigators must still rely on conventional evidence gathering before reaching any investigative conclusion. Through this process, investigators identified Calvin Hoover as the individual whose DNA was consistent with the biological evidence recovered during the investigation. Hoover had died in 2015, several years before the identification was announced. Because he was deceased, investigators could not conduct interviews or pursue criminal prosecution. To verify the genealogical findings, forensic scientists conducted additional DNA comparisons using biological material legally obtained from Hoover's personal effects. According to York Regional Police, the DNA profile matched the biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. Investigators concluded that Hoover was responsible for Christine Jessup's murder. On October 15, SIL 2020, York Regional Police publicly announced the results of the investigation. During the press conference, officials stated that advances in forensic genetic genealogy had made the identification possible and emphasized that the investigation had relied upon both modern scientific techniques and the careful preservation of evidence collected in 1984. Police also made clear that there was no evidence suggesting anyone else had participated in the crime. Because Hoover had died 5 years earlier, no criminal trial would take place. Instead, the announcement represented the formal conclusion of the investigative process rather than the beginning of judicial proceedings. The identification of Hoover brought renewed attention to the earlier wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin. Investigators acknowledged that the DNA evidence not only identified the individual responsible, but also reinforced the correctness of Morin's exoneration decades earlier. The case therefore became significant for two reasons. It demonstrated the power of modern forensic science to identify an offender after many years, and it underscored the importance of objective, evidence-based investigations in preventing wrongful convictions. The Christine Jessup investigation is now widely cited in discussions of cold case investigations because it illustrates several key principles. First, careful evidence preservation can allow future scientific advances to be applied decades after a crime. Second, forensic genetic genealogy is most effective when combined with traditional detective work rather than used as a substitute for it. Third, DNA evidence can both identify the guilty and protect the innocent, highlighting its value in ensuring the accuracy of criminal investigations. Today, the case remains one of Canada's most important examples of how advances in forensic science reshaped a historic homicide investigation. Although the passage of time prevented criminal prosecution, the investigation established an evidence-based account of what happened and demonstrated how scientific innovation can provide answers long after conventional investigative methods have reached their limits. The conclusion of the Christine Jessup investigation in 2020 marked the end of one of Canada's longest-running homicide investigations, but its significance extends well beyond the identification of the individual responsible. The case is widely regarded as a milestone in Canadian criminal justice because it influenced policing practices, forensic science, evidence preservation, and public understanding of wrongful convictions. One of the most enduring lessons from the investigation is the importance of preserving physical evidence. When Christine disappeared in October 1984, investigators collected and stored biological evidence using the best procedures available at the time. Although DNA profiling was still in its infancy and forensic genetic genealogy did not yet exist, the evidence remained intact for decades. This preservation allowed scientists to apply technologies developed many years later without compromising the integrity of the original investigation. The case also demonstrated how forensic science has evolved. In the 1980s, homicide investigations relied primarily on witness interviews, physical evidence, and conventional investigative techniques. DNA testing became available only later and initially had limited capabilities. As laboratory methods improved, scientists were able to generate increasingly detailed DNA profiles from preserved biological samples. Eventually, forensic genetic genealogy provided investigators with an entirely new way to identify individuals when traditional DNA database searches produced no match. The investigation is also remembered for its role in highlighting the consequences of wrongful convictions. Guy Paul Morin's conviction and later exoneration prompted one of the most significant public inquiries in Canadian legal history. The Commission on Proceedings involving Guy Paul Morin, chaired by the Honorable Fred Kaufman, examined not only the specific errors that occurred in Morin's case, but also broader systemic issues affecting criminal investigations and prosecutions. The Kaufman Commission identified several important principles that continue to influence Canadian policing and prosecution. Among its findings was the need to avoid tunnel vision, a form of investigative bias in which investigators become overly focused on one suspect while failing to objectively evaluate alternative explanations or evidence. The Commission also emphasized improved disclosure practices, stronger forensic quality standards, better training for investigators, and greater independence for forensic laboratories. Many police services across Canada incorporated these recommendations into their investigative procedures. Detectives today receive training on cognitive bias, evidence evaluation, and the importance of continually reassessing investigative theories as new information becomes available. The Christine Jessup investigation, therefore, contributed not only to solving one homicide, but also to improving investigative practices in future cases. Another lasting impact concerns the management of cold cases. Before advances in DNA technology, many older homicide investigations had limited prospects for resolution once traditional investigative leads were exhausted. The success of forensic genetic genealogy in the Jessup case demonstrated that preserved biological evidence could remain valuable even after several decades. As a result, law enforcement agencies increasingly review historical homicide cases to determine whether modern forensic techniques might produce new investigative leads. The case also reinforced the collaborative nature of modern criminal investigations. Detectives, forensic biologists, DNA analysts, genealogists, prosecutors, and evidence custodians all contributed to the eventual resolution. No single scientific breakthrough solved the case independently. Instead, success resulted from decades of careful evidence preservation combined with advances in laboratory science and traditional investigative work. For Christine Jessup's family, the identification of the individual responsible provided factual answers after more than 35 years of uncertainty. While the passage of time meant that no criminal trial could occur because Calvin Hoover had died in 2015, investigators stated that the forensic evidence allowed them to identify him as the person responsible for the murder. The announcement concluded one of Canada's most prominent cold case investigations, although it could not undo the loss experienced by Christine's family or the years during which the crime remained unsolved. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of transparency in criminal justice. York Regional Police publicly explained the scientific methods used during the investigation and described how forensic genetic genealogy had generated investigative leads that were later confirmed through additional DNA analysis. By explaining the investigative process, authorities helped improve public understanding of both the capabilities and the limitations of modern forensic science. It is important to note that forensic genetic genealogy does not replace conventional police work. Instead, it serves as an investigative tool that generates leads requiring independent verification. In the Jessup investigation, genealogical analysis was followed by historical research, review of investigative records, and confirmatory DNA testing before police reached their conclusions. This combination of scientific innovation and traditional investigative methods is now regarded as a model for many cold case investigations. The Christine Jessup case is frequently referenced in discussions of evidence preservation because it illustrates how decisions made during the earliest stages of an investigation can influence outcomes decades later. Crime scene investigators in 1984 could not have anticipated the development of forensic genetic genealogy, yet their careful collection and preservation of evidence made its later application possible. Today, the investigation occupies an important place in Canadian criminal justice history for three principal reasons. First, it highlighted the transformative role of DNA evidence in both identifying offenders and exonerating innocent individuals. Second, it led to significant reforms in investigative and prosecutorial practices following the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin. Third, it demonstrated the potential of forensic genetic genealogy to resolve cold cases that had remained unsolved for many years. The legacy of the Christine Jessup investigation, therefore, extends beyond the resolution of a single homicide. It continues to influence police training, forensic science, evidence management, and the investigation of historical crimes across Canada. Above all, it serves as a reminder that careful investigative work, preserved evidence, and scientific progress can together provide answers long after a crime has occurred, even when those answers emerge decades later. The resolution of the Christine Jessup investigation is closely associated with the evolution of forensic DNA technology. The case illustrates how scientific advances can transform the value of evidence collected decades earlier and demonstrates why careful preservation of biological material has become a central principle in homicide investigations. When Christine Jessup disappeared in October 1984, DNA profiling was not yet available as a routine investigative tool in Canada. Detectives and forensic specialists relied on traditional investigative techniques, including witness interviews, physical evidence collection, crime scene documentation, and laboratory examinations using the technology available at the time. Nevertheless, biological evidence recovered during the investigation was carefully preserved according to accepted forensic procedures. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA profiling became increasingly important in criminal investigations worldwide. Scientists learned how to compare genetic material recovered from crime scenes with samples obtained from known individuals. These techniques made it possible not only to identify potential suspects, but also to exclude individuals who had been wrongly suspected. The Christine Jessup investigation became one of the earliest Canadian cases to demonstrate the exculpatory value of DNA evidence. Biological material collected during the original investigation was re-examined using improved laboratory methods. The results excluded Guy Paul Morin, who had previously been convicted of Christine's murder. His conviction was overturned, and he was acquitted in 1995. This development significantly influenced public confidence in forensic DNA testing and highlighted its importance in correcting wrongful convictions. After Morin's acquittal, investigators possessed a DNA profile from the unknown individual connected to the biological evidence recovered during the investigation. For many years, this profile was regularly compared with entries in Canada's National DNA Databank. The database contains DNA profiles collected under Canadian law from certain convicted offenders and crime scene evidence associated with criminal investigations. Despite repeated comparisons, investigators did not obtain a match. This outcome suggested that the unknown individual responsible for the biological evidence had never entered the national database or that no qualifying DNA sample had been collected from that person. Although frustrating for investigators, the absence of a match did not diminish the value of the DNA profile. Instead, it preserved the possibility that future scientific methods might provide another avenue for identification. One such development was forensic genetic genealogy, FG. Unlike traditional forensic DNA comparisons, which seek an exact match within criminal justice databases, FDG compares an unknown DNA profile with profiles voluntarily submitted to genealogy services by individuals researching their family history, subject to applicable legal frameworks and database policies. These comparisons identify biological relatives rather than the unknown individual directly. Once investigators identify potential relatives, professional genealogists use historical documents, including birth records, marriage records, census information, obituary notices, and publicly available genealogical sources to construct family trees. Detectives then combine this genealogical research with conventional investigative methods to determine which individuals could realistically be associated with the crime under investigation. It is important to understand that forensic genetic genealogy does not independently identify a suspect. Instead, it generates investigative leads that must be verified through additional evidence. In the Christine Jessup investigation, genealogical analysis directed investigators toward a particular family line. Detectives then examined historical records, geographic connections, timelines, and other documented information before pursuing confirmatory forensic testing. York Regional Police announced in October 2020 that this investigative process led them to Calvin Hoover. Hoover had died in 2015, 5 years before investigators publicly identified him. Police stated that additional DNA testing performed on biological material legally obtained from Hoover's personal effects confirmed that his DNA matched the biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. Investigators emphasized that their conclusions rested upon multiple stages of scientific verification rather than genealogy alone. The genealogical research generated an investigative lead, while subsequent DNA comparisons provided the scientific confirmation supporting the final investigative conclusion. The Christine Jessup case is frequently cited in forensic literature because it demonstrates several strengths of DNA evidence. First, DNA can remain scientifically valuable for decades when properly preserved. Second, improvements in laboratory technology may allow previously collected evidence to yield new information many years after a crime occurred. Third, DNA evidence serves both to identify perpetrators and to exclude innocent individuals, reinforcing the importance of objective scientific analysis within the criminal justice system. The investigation also illustrates the importance of evidence preservation. Crime scene investigators in 1984 could not have anticipated the future development of forensic genetic genealogy. Nevertheless, their decision to preserve biological evidence according to accepted standards ensured that future scientists would have material suitable for advanced analysis. This principle now guides many homicide investigations, with agencies recognizing that evidence collected today may become significantly more valuable as forensic technologies continue to evolve. At the same time, forensic genetic genealogy has prompted discussion regarding privacy, ethics, and legal oversight. Different jurisdictions have adopted different policies governing its use. Canadian authorities have emphasized that the technique must be employed within existing legal frameworks and accompanied by rigorous scientific validation. Investigative conclusions continue to require corroboration through conventional police work and confirmatory forensic testing. The resolution of the Christine Jessup investigation, therefore, reflects not a single scientific breakthrough, but the cumulative progress of forensic biology over several decades. Improvements in DNA analysis, evidence preservation, genealogical research, digital record access, and investigative methodology collectively made the identification possible. The case has become an important example for police agencies, forensic laboratories, and legal professionals studying the practical application of modern forensic science to historical homicide investigations. Today, the investigation is widely recognized as illustrating the complementary relationship between science and traditional detective work. DNA analysis provided objective biological evidence, genealogical research generated investigative leads, and experienced detectives verified those leads through careful examination of historical records and additional forensic testing. Together, these methods resolved a homicide that had remained unsolved for more than 35 years and demonstrated the continuing evolution of forensic investigation in Canada. The Christine Jessup investigation occupies a significant place in Canadian criminal justice history, not only because the homicide was eventually resolved through modern forensic science, but also because the case exposed weaknesses within the criminal justice system and contributed to reforms affecting police investigations, forensic science, and criminal prosecutions. One of the most important developments associated with the case was the public examination of the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin. Following his acquittal in 1995, after DNA testing excluded him as the source of biological evidence, the Government of Ontario established the Commission on Proceedings involving Guy Paul Morin, commonly known as the Kaufman Commission. Its purpose was not to reinvestigate Christine Jessup's murder, but to examine how an innocent individual had been convicted and to recommend improvements to reduce the likelihood of similar errors. Justice Fred Kaufman's inquiry reviewed investigative practices, prosecutorial conduct, forensic procedures, disclosure obligations, and courtroom processes. The Commission concluded that wrongful convictions rarely result from a single mistake. Instead, they often arise through a combination of human error, investigative assumptions, communication failures, and weaknesses within institutional systems. The report emphasized that criminal investigations must remain objective and that evidence inconsistent with an investigative theory should receive the same careful consideration as evidence appearing to support it. One of the Commission's most influential concepts was tunnel vision. Tunnel vision describes a situation in which investigators or prosecutors become increasingly convinced of one suspect's guilt and unintentionally interpret subsequent evidence. Through that assumption, the Kaufman Commission recommended increased awareness of cognitive bias and encouraged investigative practices designed to ensure continual reassessment of evidence throughout an investigation. Police services across Canada subsequently incorporated lessons concerning tunnel vision into detective training. Investigators are encouraged to challenge their own assumptions, seek independent review of significant cases, and evaluate alternative explanations when new evidence emerges. While these practices cannot eliminate investigative error entirely, they are intended to reduce the risk of confirmation bias affecting criminal investigations. The Christine Jessup case also contributed to changes in forensic science. During the years following the investigation, forensic laboratories adopted increasingly rigorous quality assurance procedures, standardized documentation practices, and expanded accreditation requirements. Scientific evidence became subject to enhanced review processes designed to ensure accuracy, transparency, and reproducibility. These developments reflected broader international advances in forensic science, while also responding to lessons identified through Canadian public inquiries. Evidence management likewise evolved. Agencies increasingly recognized that biological evidence collected during homicide investigations might retain value indefinitely. Rather than viewing evidence storage primarily as an administrative responsibility, police services began emphasizing long-term preservation as an essential investigative function. The Jessup investigation demonstrated that evidence collected in 1984 remained suitable for advanced DNA analysis decades later because preservation standards had been maintained consistently. Cold case investigations also changed significantly. Historically, many unsolved homicides remained inactive after traditional investigative leads had been exhausted. Advances in DNA technology and forensic genetic genealogy altered this perspective. Police agencies now periodically review historical homicide files to determine whether improvements in forensic science or investigative techniques justify renewed examination. The Christine Jessup investigation is frequently cited as an example of how preserved evidence can acquire new significance as scientific capabilities evolve. The case also influenced public understanding of DNA evidence. Before the widespread adoption of forensic DNA profiling, criminal investigations depended primarily upon eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, confessions, and circumstantial evidence. DNA analysis introduced an objective scientific method capable of both identifying individuals and excluding innocent suspects. The Jessup investigation demonstrated both aspects of Dana's value. It confirmed Guy Paul Moran's innocence and later helped identify Calvin Hoover as the individual responsible for the crime. The successful application of forensic genetic genealogy further expanded discussions regarding investigative technology. Unlike conventional DNA database searches, forensic genetic genealogy identifies biological relatives whose publicly available genetic information may provide investigative leads. The technique generated considerable interest among law enforcement agencies because it offered a potential solution for cases in which traditional DNA databases produced no matches. At the same time, legal scholars and policymakers examined privacy considerations, informed consent, and appropriate oversight governing the use of genealogical databases in criminal investigations. York Regional Police emphasized that forensic genetic genealogy served only as an investigative tool within the Jessup case. Genealogical research generated leads that detectives subsequently verified through additional DNA testing and conventional investigative methods. This distinction remains an important principle in modern cold case investigations. Genealogy directs investigators toward potential suspects, but does not itself establish criminal responsibility. Another lasting consequence of the case concerns public confidence in the criminal justice system. Wrongful convictions can undermine trust in investigative institutions, while scientifically supported exonerations demonstrate the justice system's capacity to correct errors when new evidence becomes available. Similarly, the eventual identification of the perpetrator through preserved forensic evidence reinforced confidence in long-term investigative persistence and the value of continued scientific advancement. The investigation also highlighted the importance of institutional continuity, and evidence custodians contributed to the investigation. Personnel changed, technologies advanced, and investigative methods evolved, yet careful documentation ensured that successive investigators could continue building upon earlier work without losing critical historical information. For historians of criminal justice, the Jessup investigation illustrates the transition from traditional homicide investigation toward evidence-driven forensic investigation. The original investigation relied primarily upon witness interviews, physical searches, and conventional forensic methods. By 2020, advanced DNA analysis, computerized record systems, digital genealogy research, and highly specialized laboratory techniques had become central investigative tools. The case therefore reflects broader developments in policing and forensic science that occurred over several decades. The investigation's influence continues today. Police academies, forensic science programs, and legal education courses frequently reference the Christine Jessup case when discussing evidence preservation, investigative bias, wrongful convictions, DNA analysis, and forensic genetic genealogy. Rather than being remembered solely as a tragic homicide, the case has become an important educational example demonstrating both the strengths and the limitations of criminal investigations. Ultimately, the broader impact of the Christine Jessup investigation lies in its contribution to institutional learning. It reinforced the necessity of preserving evidence, maintaining investigative objectivity, embracing scientific innovation responsibly, and recognizing that justice sometimes depends upon technologies unavailable when a crime first occurs. These lessons continue shaping homicide investigations throughout Canada and remain relevant as forensic science continues advancing in the years ahead. The Christine Jessup investigation is frequently referenced by investigators, forensic scientists, and legal scholars because it demonstrates how the investigation of an unsolved homicide can evolve over decades while remaining grounded in the same physical evidence collected at the original crime scene. The case illustrates that the passage of time does not necessarily diminish the investigative value of properly preserved evidence. Instead, scientific progress may increase that value as new analytical methods become available. One of the central lessons from the investigation concerns evidence preservation. Crime scene investigators in 1984 documented the scene, collected biological evidence, maintained chain of custody records, and stored materials according to accepted forensic practices of the time. Those procedures ensured that decades later, the evidence remained suitable for increasingly sophisticated DNA analysis. Had the biological material been contaminated, discarded, or improperly stored, later scientific advances, including forensic genetic genealogy, would likely have been impossible to apply. The case therefore reinforced an important principle now emphasized in homicide investigations worldwide. Investigators cannot predict which evidence may become decisive in the future. As forensic science continues advancing, material considered of limited value today may become highly significant years later. Consequently, many law enforcement agencies have adopted long-term evidence retention policies, particularly for homicide and unidentified human remains cases. Another major lesson concerns the role of cold case review units. Historically, many unsolved homicide investigations remained inactive after traditional investigative leads had been exhausted. During the past 2 decades, however, police services have increasingly established specialized cold case teams responsible for periodically reviewing older investigations. These reviews examine whether advances in forensic science, database technology, digital records, or investigative techniques create new opportunities for progress. The Christine Jessup investigation demonstrates why such periodic reviews are valuable. Although investigators had possessed biological evidence since 1984, the scientific tools necessary to identify the contributor did not exist for many years. Regular reassessment of the case allowed detectives to recognize when emerging forensic technologies, including forensic genetic genealogy, could be applied effectively. The investigation also illustrates the complementary relationship between traditional detective work and modern forensic science. Advances in DNA technology did not replace conventional investigation. Instead, they expanded the range of investigative tools available. Detectives continued reviewing historical records, interviewing witnesses when appropriate, examining geographic connections, evaluating timelines, and comparing historical information alongside new scientific findings. Similarly, forensic genetic genealogy functioned as an investigative lead rather than a final conclusion. Genealogical analysis identified biological relatives of the unknown DNA source. Professional genealogists then reconstructed family relationships using historical records and publicly available documents. Detectives subsequently narrowed the list of potential individuals through conventional investigative methods before confirmatory DNA testing was performed. This multi-step process reflects current best practices in the use of forensic genetic genealogy. Another important lesson involves interdisciplinary cooperation. The successful resolution of the Jessup investigation depended upon collaboration among detectives, forensic biologists, genealogists, evidence custodians, prosecutors, legal advisors, and laboratory specialists. Each discipline contributed different expertise while working toward a common investigative objective. Modern homicide investigations increasingly recognize the value of such multidisciplinary approaches, particularly in complex cold cases. The investigation also highlights the significance of institutional memory. Over the course of more than 3 decades, numerous investigators participated in the case. Careful documentation, including witness statements, forensic reports, crime scene records, evidence inventories, and investigative notes allowed successive detectives to understand earlier investigative decisions and continue building upon previous work. Comprehensive documentation therefore served as an essential investigative resource long after the original investigators had left the case. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin further reinforced lessons regarding investigative objectivity. Following Morin's exoneration, the Kaufman Commission emphasized the risks associated with cognitive bias and tunnel vision. These concepts continue influencing detective training throughout Canada. Investigators are encouraged to evaluate evidence objectively, reconsider investigative assumptions as new information emerges, and ensure that alternative explanations receive appropriate consideration throughout an investigation. The Christine Jessup investigation also demonstrates the value of DNA evidence as both inculpatory and exculpatory evidence. DNA analysis helped establish that Guy Paul Morin was not responsible for the crime while later identifying Calvin Hoover through preserved biological evidence. This dual function distinguishes DNA from many other forms of evidence. It can identify offenders while simultaneously protecting innocent individuals from wrongful prosecution. Another enduring lesson concerns scientific patience. Forensic advances rarely occur in isolation. Improvements in DNA extraction, amplification, sequencing, computational biology, genealogical research, and digital record access collectively expanded investigative possibilities over several decades. The eventual resolution of the Jessup investigation reflects cumulative scientific progress rather than a single technological breakthrough. The case has also influenced discussions regarding the ethical use of forensic genetic genealogy. Because genealogical research involves family relationships extending beyond an individual's suspect, investigators and policymakers continue examining privacy protections, legal authority, informed consent, and appropriate oversight governing the use of genealogical databases. The Jessup investigation illustrates both the investigative potential of the technique and the importance of applying it within established legal and ethical frameworks. Educational institutions now frequently use the case when teaching criminal investigation, forensic biology, criminal procedure, and legal ethics. Students examine how evidence preservation, investigative documentation, scientific validation, judicial review, and institutional reform interacted over the life of the investigation. Rather than studying the case solely as a historical event, they analyze it as an example of how criminal justice systems adapt through experience and scientific development. From a historical perspective, the Christine Jessup investigation spans several eras of forensic science. It began during a period dominated by conventional investigative methods, continued through the emergence of DNA profiling, incorporated lessons learned from wrongful conviction inquiries, and concluded using forensic genetic genealogy supported by modern molecular biology. Few investigations illustrate this scientific evolution as clearly. Today, the case remains one of Canada's most significant examples of long-term investigative persistence. It demonstrates that properly preserved evidence, objective investigative practice, interdisciplinary collaboration, and responsible scientific innovation can together resolve cases once believed unlikely to be solved. Although the passage of time prevented criminal prosecution following the identification of Calvin Hoover, the investigation nevertheless established an evidence-based account of responsibility and contributed lasting lessons that continue shaping homicide investigations, forensic science, and criminal justice policy throughout Canada. The Christine Jessup investigation remains one of the most influential homicide cases in Canadian criminal justice because its impact extended far beyond the resolution of a single crime. It changed investigative practices, strengthened confidence in forensic science, prompted institutional reforms following a wrongful conviction, and demonstrated how advances in DNA technology can fundamentally alter the outcome of decades-old cold cases. One of the investigation's most enduring legacies is its contribution to the development of cold case investigation strategies. During the years immediately following Christine's disappearance in 1984, investigators relied primarily on witness interviews, physical searches, forensic examinations, and conventional detective work. Although these methods remained essential, they were limited by the scientific capabilities available at the time. As forensic science progressed over the following decades, the preserved evidence acquired new investigative value. Law enforcement agencies increasingly recognized that homicide investigations should not be viewed as permanently exhausted simply because immediate investigative leads had ended. Instead, unsolved cases containing preserved biological evidence became candidates for periodic review whenever significant advances in forensic science occurred. This approach has since become a common feature of specialized cold case units throughout Canada and many other jurisdictions. The investigation also reinforced the principle that scientific evidence should complement rather than replace traditional investigative work. Forensic genetic genealogy, which ultimately generated the lead identifying Calvin Hoover, did not independently solve the case. Instead, genealogy directed investigators toward a family line requiring additional investigation. Detectives then reviewed historical records, evaluated timelines, examined geographic connections, and obtained confirmatory DNA evidence before reaching investigative conclusions. This combination of scientific analysis and conventional police work has become an increasingly recognized model for modern cold case investigations. DNA evidence provides objective biological information, while detectives supply the contextual investigation necessary to evaluate and verify scientific findings. Another lasting contribution concerns long-term evidence management. The biological evidence collected during the original investigation remained suitable for advanced forensic analysis because investigators maintained appropriate preservation procedures over several decades. This outcome reinforced the importance of rigorous evidence storage protocols for homicide investigations, particularly those involving unidentified offenders. Many forensic laboratories and police agencies subsequently reviewed evidence retention policies to ensure that biological material from serious crimes would remain available for future scientific examination. As laboratory methods continue improving, evidence collected today may become increasingly valuable many years later. The Jessup investigation is frequently cited as an example of why careful evidence preservation remains one of the most important responsibilities in criminal investigation. The case also continues influencing investigator training. Detective training programs across Canada often reference the investigation when discussing investigative objectivity, documentation standards, evidence preservation, and cognitive bias. Following the Kaufman Commission, investigators received greater instruction regarding tunnel vision, the tendency to focus excessively on one investigative theory while giving insufficient consideration to alternative explanations. Modern investigative practice encourages continual reassessment of evidence throughout an investigation. Detectives are trained to distinguish confirmed facts from assumptions, evaluate new evidence objectively, and remain open to revising investigative theories when reliable information becomes available. These practices seek to reduce the risk of wrongful convictions while improving the overall quality of criminal investigations. The investigation further strengthened appreciation for DNA evidence as an objective forensic tool. The same biological evidence that excluded Guy Paul Moran from the investigation later contributed to identifying Calvin Hoover. This dual role illustrates one of DNA's most significant strengths within criminal justice. Unlike many forms of evidence that depend upon interpretation or human recollection, DNA provides scientifically measurable information capable of both identifying individuals and excluding innocent persons. The Jessup investigation also illustrates the importance of institutional continuity. Over more than 3 decades, numerous detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and evidence custodians participated in the investigation. Comprehensive documentation, including investigative reports, forensic analyses, witness statements, and evidence inventories, allowed successive investigators to understand previous work without repeating earlier efforts. Such continuity is essential in long-term investigations where personnel inevitably change over time. Another enduring lesson concerns the relationship between technology and justice. Scientific advances do not automatically resolve criminal investigations. Instead, they create new opportunities that depend upon careful preparation, professional expertise, and preserved evidence. In the Jessup investigation, technological progress became meaningful because investigators in 1984 had carefully documented the crime scene and preserved biological material according to accepted forensic standards. The case also contributed to broader discussions regarding forensic genetic genealogy. Following its successful application in several high-profile investigations internationally, the Jessup case demonstrated the technique's potential within Canada. At the same time, it highlighted the need for appropriate legal oversight, scientific validation, and ethical consideration when using genealogical information during criminal investigations. Investigators emphasized that genealogical analysis generated investigative leads rather than serving as independent proof of criminal responsibility. From a historical perspective, the Christine Jessup investigation reflects the remarkable evolution of forensic science during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The investigation began before DNA profiling became available, continued through the widespread adoption of forensic DNA analysis, and concluded with the assistance of forensic genetic genealogy. Few criminal investigations illustrate this progression as clearly. The investigation is also remembered because it produced 2 important outcomes simultaneously. First, it established through DNA evidence that Guy Paul Moran had been wrongfully convicted. Second, decades later, it identified Calvin Hoover through preserved biological evidence and genealogical investigation. Together, these developments demonstrate that forensic science serves both to protect innocent individuals and to identify those responsible for criminal acts. Today, police services, forensic laboratories, legal professionals, and academic researchers continue studying the Christine Jessup investigation as an example of evidence preservation, scientific innovation, institutional reform, and investigative persistence. The case is frequently included in criminal justice education because it demonstrates how advances in science can reshape historical investigations while reinforcing the importance of objective investigative practices. Ultimately, the lasting legacy of the Christine Jessup investigation lies in the lessons it provides for future homicide investigations. It demonstrates that careful evidence preservation, rigorous scientific standards, interdisciplinary cooperation, objective investigative methods, and periodic cold case review together create opportunities for justice that may not exist when a crime first occurs. As forensic science continues evolving, the case remains a reminder that evidence collected today may answer questions many years in the future, ensuring that even long unsolved investigations retain the possibility of resolution through responsible scientific inquiry. The Christine Jessup investigation continues to be studied because it demonstrates how advances in forensic science, combined with careful investigative practices, can reshape the outcome of an unsolved homicide decades after the crime occurred. Rather than being remembered solely as a historical investigation, the case has become a practical example for police agencies, forensic laboratories, legal professionals, and researchers examining the future of cold case investigations. One of the clearest lessons from the investigation concerns the long-term value of biological evidence. During the original homicide investigation in 1984, investigators collected and preserved biological material according to accepted forensic procedures. At that time, they could not have anticipated the future development of modern DNA profiling or forensic genetic genealogy. Nevertheless, those early preservation efforts ensured that the evidence remained suitable for increasingly advanced laboratory analysis over the following decades. This experience has influenced evidence retention policies across many jurisdictions. Police agencies increasingly recognize that biological evidence associated with homicide investigations should be preserved for extended periods, often indefinitely where permitted by law. Scientific capabilities continue evolving, and evidence considered inconclusive today may produce significant results using future analytical techniques. The investigation also demonstrates the importance of periodic cold case review. Advances in science do not automatically resolve historical investigations unless agencies actively revisit older evidence. Many police services now maintain dedicated cold case units responsible for reviewing unsolved homicides on a regular basis. These reviews evaluate whether improvements in forensic science, digital databases, or investigative methodology justify renewed examination of preserved evidence. The Christine Jessup case illustrates how such reviews can be valuable. Although investigators possessed biological evidence for decades, the scientific methods ultimately leading to the identification of Calvin Hoover did not exist during the original investigation. Periodic reassessment allowed detectives to recognize when new forensic tools had become available and to determine whether those technologies could be applied appropriately. Another significant lesson concerns interdisciplinary cooperation. Modern cold case investigations increasingly require expertise from multiple professional fields. Detectives contribute investigative experience, forensic biologists conduct laboratory analysis, genealogists reconstruct family relationships, prosecutors provide legal guidance, and evidence custodians ensure the integrity of preserved materials. The Jessup investigation demonstrates that successful resolution often depends upon effective collaboration among these disciplines rather than any single investigative technique. The case also highlights the distinction between investigative leads and evidentiary conclusions. Forensic genetic genealogy generated leads by identifying biological relatives associated with the unknown DNA profile. Detectives then used conventional investigative methods, including historical research, record review, and confirmatory DNA analysis to determine whether a particular individual could be reliably connected to the evidence. This distinction remains central to responsible use of forensic genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Following the public identification of Calvin Hoover in 2020, Canadian law enforcement agencies and forensic professionals discussed the broader implications of forensic genetic genealogy. The technique demonstrated considerable potential for resolving historical cases lacking matches within traditional criminal DNA databases. At the same time, investigators emphasized the importance of legal oversight, scientific validation, privacy protections, and transparent investigative procedures whenever genealogical methods are employed. The investigation also reinforced awareness of cognitive bias within criminal investigations. lessons learned through the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin continue influencing detective education throughout Canada. Modern investigative training encourages detectives to evaluate evidence objectively, document investigative reasoning carefully, and remain willing to reconsider conclusions when reliable new evidence emerges. These practices seek to reduce the influence of tunnel vision while strengthening investigative accuracy. For forensic laboratories, the Jessup investigation underscores the importance of maintaining rigorous scientific standards. DNA evidence derives its reliability not merely from advanced technology, but from validated laboratory procedures, quality assurance systems, accurate documentation, and strict chain of custody practices. Every stage of forensic analysis must be carefully documented to ensure that scientific findings remain reliable and legally admissible. Educational institutions frequently include the case in courses covering forensic biology, criminal investigation, legal ethics, and criminal procedure. Students examine how evidence preservation, wrongful conviction, DNA analysis, forensic genealogy, and institutional reform intersected throughout the investigation. The case therefore serves not only as an example of scientific progress, but also as a reminder of the importance of continuous learning within criminal justice professions. The investigation further illustrates how technology changes the questions investigators are able to ask. In 1984, investigators lacked the ability to identify an unknown individual solely through preserved biological evidence. By 2020, forensic genetic genealogy made such investigation possible under appropriate legal and scientific conditions. This evolution reflects broader developments in molecular biology, computational genetics, digital record systems, and genealogical research. Importantly, however, the investigation also demonstrates that technology alone cannot solve criminal cases. Scientific advances depend upon earlier investigative decisions, particularly careful evidence collection, preservation, documentation, and record management. Without these foundational investigative practices, later technological developments would have had little practical effect. Another enduring contribution of the Christine Jessup investigation lies in its influence on public understanding of forensic science. The case illustrates that DNA evidence can both identify offenders and exonerate innocent individuals. This dual role reinforces the importance of objective scientific analysis within criminal investigations, while demonstrating that forensic evidence serves the broader goal of establishing factual accuracy rather than supporting predetermined investigative theories. Today, the investigation is widely regarded as one of Canada's most significant cold case resolutions. It is frequently referenced by police services reviewing historical homicide investigations, by forensic scientists studying long-term evidence preservation, and by legal scholars examining the relationship between scientific innovation and criminal justice reform. Ultimately, the continuing influence of the Christine Jessup investigation extends well beyond the identification of the individual responsible for the crime. It has shaped investigative training, evidence management, forensic science, wrongful conviction reform, and cold case methodology across Canada. The case demonstrates that justice sometimes depends not only on persistence, but also on the willingness of investigators and scientists to revisit historical evidence with new tools, new knowledge, and an enduring commitment to objective, evidence-based investigation. By the time York Regional Police publicly announced in October 2020 that forensic genetic genealogy had led investigators to identify Calvin Hoover as the person responsible for Christine Jessup's murder, more than 36 years had passed since Christine disappeared on October 3, 1984. During those decades, the investigation had moved through several distinct phases: the search for a missing child, a homicide investigation, the prosecution and eventual exoneration of Guy Paul Morin, the establishment of a public inquiry into the wrongful conviction, and finally, the application of modern forensic science to evidence preserved since the original investigation. Few Canadian criminal investigations have had such a broad and lasting impact. From a historical perspective, the investigation illustrates how criminal justice systems evolve over time. Investigative methods available in 1984 differed substantially from those available in 2020A. Early investigators relied primarily on witness interviews, physical searches, crime scene documentation, and conventional forensic examinations. DNA profiling had not yet become part of routine criminal investigation, and forensic genetic genealogy did not exist. As scientific capabilities expanded, however, the preserved evidence acquired new investigative value, demonstrating that the significance of forensic evidence can increase rather than diminish as technology advances. The case also underscores the importance of institutional continuity. Over more than 3 decades, responsibility for the investigation passed among numerous detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, evidence custodians, and police administrators. Despite these personnel changes, comprehensive investigative files, laboratory records, evidence inventories, and witness documentation allowed successive investigators to continue building upon earlier work. Careful record-keeping ensured that valuable information remained accessible long after the original investigators had completed their involvement. Another important historical lesson concerns the role of evidence preservation. Biological material collected during the original investigation remained scientifically useful because it had been stored under conditions designed to maintain its integrity. Modern forensic laboratories increasingly emphasize that homicide evidence should be preserved for extended periods, recognizing that future analytical methods may reveal information unavailable using contemporary technology. The Christine Jessup investigation is frequently cited as an example of why long-term evidence retention policies are essential in serious criminal investigations. The investigation further demonstrated the evolving relationship between science and criminal investigation. DNA analysis did not replace conventional detective work. Rather, it complemented it. Detectives continued reviewing historical records, evaluating investigative timelines, examining geographic relationships, and verifying scientific findings through additional investigative steps. The successful identification of Calvin Hoover resulted from the combination of preserved forensic evidence, genealogical research, and traditional police investigation rather than any single scientific procedure. One of the case's most significant contributions lies in its influence on wrongful conviction reform. The exoneration of Guy Paul Moran and the subsequent Kaufman Commission prompted widespread examination of investigative practices, forensic standards, prosecutorial responsibilities, and disclosure obligations. Many recommendations emerging from the Commission continue influencing Canadian criminal justice today, particularly those addressing tunnel vision, cognitive bias, and the importance of maintaining investigative objectivity throughout criminal investigations. The concept of tunnel vision remains especially relevant. Investigators are now routinely trained to distinguish confirmed evidence from investigative assumptions and to remain open to alternative explanations as new information emerges. The Christine Jessup investigation demonstrates how objective scientific evidence can challenge earlier investigative conclusions and reinforce the importance of continually reassessing available information. The case also contributed to greater appreciation of the dual role of DNA evidence. DNA serves both as a means of identifying individuals connected to a crime and as a powerful mechanism for excluding innocent persons. In the Jessup investigation, DNA evidence played both roles. It supported Guy Paul Moran's exoneration and, years later, contributed to the identification of Calvin Hoover. This dual function has become one of the defining characteristics of forensic DNA analysis within modern criminal justice. Forensic genetic genealogy likewise occupies an important place in the investigation's historical significance. Although the technique had already attracted international attention before its use in the Jessup investigation, the case demonstrated its practical application within Canada. At the same time, investigators emphasized that genealogy functions as an investigative tool rather than conclusive proof. Genealogical analysis generated leads that required confirmation through additional DNA testing and conventional investigative methods before investigators reached their conclusions. The investigation has also influenced professional education. Police academies, forensic science programs, law schools, and criminal justice courses frequently examine the Jessup investigation when discussing evidence preservation, wrongful convictions, investigative bias, DNA technology, and cold case methodology. Students studying these subjects often encounter the case as an example of how scientific innovation, institutional learning, and careful investigative practice intersect within real criminal investigations. Another enduring lesson concerns the relationship between time and forensic evidence. Witness memories naturally fade, communities change, and investigators retire. Physical evidence, however, can remain scientifically valuable for decades when preserved correctly. This principle now informs evidence management practices in homicide investigations throughout Canada and many other jurisdictions. Investigators increasingly recognize that evidence collected today may become significantly more valuable as forensic science continues advancing. The Christine Jessup investigation also demonstrates the importance of public transparency. When York Regional Police announced the identification of Calvin Hoover in 2020, officials described the investigative methods used, the role of forensic genetic genealogy, and the scientific confirmation supporting their conclusions. This transparency helped explain both the strengths and the limitations of modern forensic science, while reinforcing public confidence in evidence-based criminal investigations. Finally, the investigation serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice often extends beyond criminal prosecution. Because Calvin Hoover died in 2015, no criminal trial could occur following his identification. Nevertheless, investigators were able to establish an evidence-based account of responsibility through preserved forensic evidence and modern scientific analysis. While this outcome could not reverse the tragedy of Christine Jessup's death or the years of uncertainty experienced by her family, it provided documented answers supported by objective forensic evidence. Today, the Christine Jessup investigation is remembered not only as one of Canada's most important cold case investigations, but also as a landmark in the evolution of forensic science and criminal justice. It demonstrates the enduring value of careful evidence preservation, objective investigation, interdisciplinary cooperation, and scientific innovation. The lessons learned continue influencing homicide investigations across Canada, ensuring that future investigators benefit from the experience gained through one of the country's most significant and historically important criminal investigations. The public announcement on October 15, SIL 2020, represented a historic moment in Canadian criminal investigation. After more than 36 years of uncertainty, York Regional Police announced that the homicide of 9-year-old Christine Jessup had been resolved through advances in forensic science. The identification of Calvin Hoover as the individual responsible for Christina's murder marked the conclusion of one of Canada's longest-running cold case investigations and demonstrated the extraordinary impact of modern DNA technology. The investigation's final breakthrough was the result of a process that combined several generations of forensic advancement. Evidence collected during the original investigation in 1984 had remained preserved for decades. Traditional DNA database searches had previously failed to identify a suspect because no direct match was available. The development of forensic genetic genealogy provided investigators with a new pathway by allowing them to examine biological relationships connected to the unknown DNA profile. The genealogical investigation did not immediately identify an offender. Instead, it generated information about possible relatives connected to the unknown genetic profile. Investigators and genealogists then examined family relationships using historical records and publicly available information. This process required careful analysis and extensive verification, because genetic relationships alone do not establish criminal responsibility. After potential individuals were identified, investigators returned to conventional police methods. They reviewed available records, considered historical information, and examined whether individuals connected to the genealogical findings could be associated with the circumstances of Christina's murder. The scientific process was followed by investigative confirmation, demonstrating the importance of combining forensic innovation with traditional detective work. Police later obtained biological material associated with Calvin Hoover and conducted DNA testing. According to York Regional Police, the resulting comparison confirmed that Hoover's DNA matched the biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. Investigators stated that this evidence established Hoover as the person responsible for Christine Jessup's murder. The identification came after Hoover had already died in 2015. Because he was deceased, the case could not proceed to a criminal trial. This created a unique situation. Investigators had reached an evidence-based conclusion, but the judicial process of prosecution and conviction could not occur. The resolution therefore depended on forensic findings and investigative verification rather than a courtroom verdict. This distinction is important in criminal justice. A criminal conviction requires prosecution, legal proceedings, and a judgment made through the court system. When a suspect dies before charges can proceed, investigators may still reach conclusions based on available evidence, but those conclusions do not carry the same legal status as a court conviction. In the Jessup investigation, authorities presented the forensic evidence supporting their conclusion while acknowledging the limitations created by Hoover's death. The resolution also renewed attention on the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Moran. The case had already become a major example of the importance of DNA evidence because the same investigation that eventually identified the person responsible also demonstrated that Moran had not committed the crime. His exoneration became a significant moment in Canadian legal history and contributed to reforms designed to reduce the risk of future wrongful convictions. The contrast between Moran's wrongful conviction and Hoover's identification illustrates one of the most important functions of forensic science, protecting accuracy within the justice system. Scientific evidence can challenge incorrect conclusions, prevent innocent individuals from being punished, and provide reliable information when traditional investigative methods are insufficient. The case also highlighted the importance of humility within criminal investigations. Investigators must recognize that early conclusions may be incomplete and that future evidence may alter the understanding of a case. The Christine Jessup investigation demonstrated how maintaining objectivity and preserving evidence can allow future generations of investigators to correct mistakes and discover information unavailable to earlier investigators. The use of forensic genetic genealogy in the case also contributed to broader discussions about privacy, ethics, and regulation. As the technique became more widely used in criminal investigations, questions emerged regarding the appropriate use of genetic information, the responsibilities of law enforcement agencies, and the need for clear guidelines. The Jessup investigation became part of these discussions because it demonstrated both the potential benefits and the complex considerations associated with genealogical DNA analysis. For law enforcement agencies, the case reinforced several operational lessons. First, serious criminal evidence should be preserved whenever legally and practically possible. Second, cold cases should be periodically reviewed as scientific capabilities evolve. Third, investigators should combine new technologies with traditional investigative methods rather than relying exclusively on one approach. These principles have become increasingly important in modern homicide investigations. Forensic scientists also viewed the case as an example of how scientific progress builds over time. The evidence collected in 1984 could not be fully utilized with the technology available at that moment. However, later developments in DNA analysis and genealogy transformed that same evidence into a powerful investigative resource. The case demonstrates that scientific advancement is often cumulative, with each generation of researchers expanding the possibilities available to future investigators. The investigation also had a lasting impact on the Jessup family and the wider community. For decades, unanswered questions surrounded Christine's death. While no resolution could undo the loss or restore the years that had passed, the identification provided factual answers supported by forensic evidence. The conclusion of the investigation allowed the historical record to reflect what investigators determined through scientific analysis rather than leaving the case permanently unresolved. Beyond the individuals directly connected to the case, the investigation influenced how society understands cold cases. It challenged the assumption that crimes become impossible to solve simply because many years have passed. Instead, it demonstrated that preserved evidence and evolving technology can create opportunities that did not exist at the time of the original investigation. The Christine Jessup case remains a significant example of how criminal investigations can span generations. It began with traditional policing methods in the 1980s, continued through the era of DNA profiling and wrongful conviction reform, and concluded through the application of forensic genetic genealogy in the 21st century. Few cases illustrate the transformation of forensic investigation as clearly. Ultimately, the resolution of Christine Jessup's murder represents both a conclusion and a lesson. It concluded a decades-long search for answers, but it also reinforced principles that continue guiding criminal investigations today. Preserve evidence, remain objective, embrace scientific advancement responsibly, and continue seeking the truth even when years have passed. The case stands as a reminder that justice can sometimes require patience measured not in days or months, but in decades. The resolution of the Christine Jessup murder investigation in 2020 marked the end of one of Canada West's most closely followed cold cases, but the significance of the investigation continues far beyond the identification of the person responsible. The case has become an important example of how forensic science, investigative persistence, and institutional learning can transform an investigation that remained unresolved for decades. Christine Jessup disappeared on October 3, 1984, in Ontario. Her disappearance immediately led to a major search effort involving police, volunteers, and members of the community. After her remains were discovered on December 31, 1984, the investigation shifted into a homicide inquiry. Detectives worked to determine who was responsible, but the case became increasingly complex as years passed without a definitive answer. The investigation entered a controversial period when Guy Paul Morin was identified as a suspect, prosecuted, and convicted of Christina's murder. However, advances in DNA testing later demonstrated that Morin was not responsible. His conviction was overturned, and he was acquitted in 1995. The case became a major example of the dangers of investigative errors and contributed to significant discussions about improving criminal justice procedures in Canada. The subsequent Kaufman Commission examined the circumstances surrounding Morin's wrongful conviction and identified important lessons for law enforcement and the justice system. Among the central themes were the dangers of tunnel vision, the importance of considering alternative investigative possibilities, the need for reliable forensic practices, and the importance of full disclosure of relevant evidence. These lessons influence changes in investigative training and professional standards. Modern investigators are encouraged to maintain objectivity, challenge assumptions, and continuously reassess evidence throughout an investigation. The goal is to ensure that investigations remain focused on establishing facts rather than confirming early theories. Forensic science ultimately became the key to resolving the Christine Jessup investigation. The biological evidence preserved from the original crime scene remained available for examination as DNA technology developed. Traditional DNA database searches did not initially produce an identification, but advances in forensic genetic genealogy created a new investigative opportunity. Forensic genetic genealogy allowed investigators to examine relationships connected to the unknown DNA profile, rather than producing an immediate suspect identification, the process generated investigative leads that were evaluated through traditional detective work. Investigators examined historical records, family relationships, and other relevant information before conducting additional DNA testing. In 2020, York Regional Police announced that this process had identified Calvin Hoover as the person responsible for Christine Jessup Hess' murder. Police stated that DNA testing confirmed the match between Hoover's genetic profile and the biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. Because Hoover had died in 2015, no criminal prosecution could take place. The outcome demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of modern forensic investigation. Scientific evidence could establish responsibility, but the absence of a living suspect meant the case could not proceed through a criminal trial. Instead, the resolution relied upon forensic findings, investigative verification, and the public explanation of the evidence supporting the conclusion. The Christine Jessup case is particularly significant because it demonstrates the evolving role of DNA in criminal justice. DNA evidence first played a role in protecting an innocent person by excluding Guy Paul Morin. Decades later, the same investigation benefited from scientific progress that helped identify the person responsible. The case therefore illustrates both major functions of forensic DNA: preventing wrongful convictions and assisting in the identification of offenders. The investigation also reinforced the importance of preserving evidence for future generations. When the original evidence was collected in 1984, investigators could not have predicted how dramatically forensic technology would advance. The eventual breakthrough depended on decisions made decades earlier by preserving biological material and maintaining detailed investigative records. Cold case investigators around the world have studied the Jessup investigation because it demonstrates that unresolved cases can remain active opportunities for discovery. Advances in molecular biology, digital records, genealogy research, and analytical techniques continue creating new possibilities for investigations that once appeared unlikely to progress. At the same time, the case has contributed to ongoing conversations about the responsible use of forensic genetic genealogy. While the technique has helped resolve serious crimes, it also raises questions regarding privacy, consent, data protection, and legal oversight. The Christine Jessup investigation is part of the broader discussion about balancing investigative effectiveness with individual rights. Another important legacy of the case is the emphasis on collaboration. The final resolution required cooperation between police investigators, forensic laboratories, genealogists, evidence specialists, and other professionals. Modern complex investigations increasingly depend on this type of multidisciplinary approach, where different areas of expertise contribute to a shared objective. The case also remains an example of how criminal investigations can change over time. The investigators who worked on the original case in the 1980s operated with the tools and knowledge available during that period. Later, investigators inherited the case file and evidence, applying technologies and methods that previous generations could not have imagined. The continuity between these stages demonstrates the importance of preserving investigative knowledge across decades. For Christine Jessup Hess' family and the community affected by the crime, the 2020 announcement brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Although no legal trial occurred and no sentence was imposed, investigators provided an evidence-based conclusion supported by modern forensic analysis. The resolution allowed the historical record of the case to move from uncertainty toward documented findings. Today, the Christine Jessup investigation remains one of Canada's most notable examples of forensic advancement and criminal justice reform. It represents the intersection of tragedy, scientific progress, and institutional learning. The case reminds investigators that evidence must be preserved, assumptions must be questioned, and new technologies must be applied carefully and responsibly. The story of the investigation is ultimately not only about a crime committed in 1984, it is also about the decades of work that followed, the evolution of forensic science, and the determination to seek answers despite extraordinary challenges. The case demonstrates that even investigations separated from their origins by many years can still provide important truths when evidence, science, and careful investigative practice come together. The legacy of Christine Jessup's case continues to influence how modern cold cases are approached. It stands as a reminder that time does not always erase the possibility of resolution, and that advancements in science can provide answers to questions that remained unanswered for generations.